before I begin, I am a molecular biologist. I'm happy to talk about anything you want to talk about related to HIV. I spend about half my year over in Uganda, doing research over in Uganda, and my other half is here at the Gladstone Institute at UCSF. So I thought I would sort of talk to you sort of generally about the HIV epidemic sort of globally, and then talk a little bit about the science, a little bit about the work that we do. But at any time, just jump in there and ask questions, and I'll do my best. Some of this stuff gets into areas which I'm not as familiar with, so I'm happy to follow up with you by email or something. If I don't know the answer. I thought we'd start sort of the most basic sort of question. What are people dying of throughout the world? And of course, the things that people die from are changing rapidly, the types of diseases, but still, infectious diseases cause 26% of the deaths globally. Now, this is changing as people, as McDonald's continues its march towards global domination. You start seeing McDonald's in Africa, and people are starting to die of chronic diseases. But it really still is infectious diseases, and it's infectious diseases, particularly in the developing world, in places like Africa. And the people who really get hit the hardest by these infectious diseases are children, and in particular children under 5. So what are the major infectious diseases that we're talking about? It's really the gang of 4. HIV/AIDS, which causes about 2.8 million deaths a year. Malaria, which causes 1.3 million deaths. But really, the burden from malaria is much greater. We think there are around 500 million malaria infections annually. And so even if you don't die from malaria, just getting infected by malaria can keep you out of work, can make you sick. Tuberculosis, which is often associated with HIV, and neglected tropical diseases. These are things like parasites, like hookworm, African sleeping sickness, trypanosomiasis. And I was just reading a paper the other day. It's surprising that we still have these parasitic infections here in the United States, particularly down on the U.S.-Mexican border. I mean, thousands of these infections a year, actually. But to really look at HIV, which HIV really is sort of the #1 infectious disease that's causing the greatest health burden in developing countries. And it's really primarily Africa, which has been hit the hardest by the HIV epidemic, although of course in the United States, and I'll talk a little bit about the US situation in a second. But even today, despite all of the efforts over the past 25 years, still have several million new infections each year. In the cohort that I work with a cohort of about 14,000 people that live in rural Uganda. And of those 14,000 people, about 13% are HIV positive. And we still see the rate of new infections, while it's decreased, still continues. So like I said, the global burden of HIV infection really is in sub-Saharan Africa. And just to talk a little bit more about the situation, one of the real tragedies has been the number of children that have been orphaned by HIV/AIDS. And just to look sort of globally at the overall situation, the prevalence is about 0.8% of humans globally are infected with HIV. In sub-Saharan Africa, it's about 5.5%. If you look total throughout the continent, although it's really concentrated in certain pockets. It tends to be along trucking routes and urban environments. One of the surprising things is that it tends to be people who are middle-income people tend to have a higher prevalence of HIV in Africa. This is because they have money to spend on prostitutes or on having multiple concurrent relationships. So this has been sort of the devastating thing for South Africa. It's people like teachers, educators, people involved in business who have really been most affected by the epidemic. And then the these are the prevalence rates throughout the rest of the world. But here in the United States, again, I mean, the epidemic continues, and around, just in 2006, around 56,000 new infections. There are now over 1 million people living with HIV/AIDS in the United States. And of course, the big problem really is the number of people who are living with HIV but don't know they're living with HIV. People who don't go and get tested. And this becomes a real problem because it's impossible to get them on treatment or any type of structured intervention. In California ranks second behind New York in terms of the total number of AIDS cases, about 7,000 new infections each year, and men make up the vast majority of HIV-positive cases in the state. And in San Francisco, I was just saying to Anton tonight, I just moved here from the East Coast about 6 months ago. And so for me, I mean, actually the epidemic in San Francisco is very different from Washington, D.C. I'm from D.C., and there the epidemic is really a heterosexual epidemic, and it's really affecting heterosexual couples. Of course, here in San Francisco, it's mainly men who have sex with men. Still, despite all the efforts, there's still about 400 new cases reported. And San Francisco has done a good job of getting people access to antiretrovirals. About 90% of people living with AIDS, about 70% who are HIV positive or eligible for are receiving antiretroviral therapy. And the reason why that number is not higher is probably, this takes into account people who are infected but they haven't gone and gotten tested, and so we don't necessarily know that they are infected, but they would be eligible for antiretroviral therapy if they could get tested. Again, for me, I just spent 2 years working in Washington, D.C., and really the epidemic is really out of control in Washington. And as I was putting together this presentation, I was sort of thinking about what makes D.C. different than San Francisco. And I think D.C. has just been really late in terms of recognizing the epidemic and in terms of putting in place of all the behavioral interventions and really doing the kind of testing and the kind of community outreach that has happened in San Francisco. In D.C., it does tend to be more of a heterosexual epidemic, which I think changes the way in which you're going to address it in the community. And of course, D.C. counts a lot of pediatric AIDS cases, but you're really talking, 1 in 20 residents of D.C., and these really are mostly African Americans who are infected with HIV. So it's of all of the urban cities in the country, it's got the highest prevalence of HIV.